Point.
We're living in a, the modern age of the new psychedelic renaissance.
And I thought, this is not real. This is, my gosh, I'm on the radio. People hear me.
What we do with our time here on the planet, and how we give to others and affect others' lives, and what we do with it is important.
Oh, wait a minute. I didn't know that's the direction we were going.
That every major spiritual tradition says, the kingdom of heaven is within.
It's about what makes you happy and satisfied.
Like you just said, you have to be able to control it. You can't let it control you.
Always part of me wanted an audience.
It's naive to think that human beings have stopped evolving.
The world is a very rich place if you start exploring.
Okay, so welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Counterpoint podcast. I'm your host, Chris Wright, and with me today is Luke West. And I'll let you introduce yourself and just say a little bit about who you are, what you do.
Perfect. Yeah. So I'm Luke. I'm the host of the Imperfect Pod. The Imperfect Pod is a podcast that discusses masculinity and manhood more intentionally and purposefully, to really kind of highlight the challenges that men are going through right now in fit, like understanding their fit to society, but also in knowing that there's not really a one size fits all idea of masculinity. So lots of questions out there is toxic masculinity a thing? Is it not a thing? I don't know what it is. I'm just trying to ask questions, talk to fathers, sons, gay men, same-sex marriages, women, everyone under the sun about what masculinity might be, although most of my guests are predominantly men. And I've had like porn addicts, porn stars, lots of different people on, and I just love the conversation.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I want to kick this off here with a little poem. It's by Jorge Luis Borges. He's an Argentinian writer. And I translated this into English myself, just to make sure everyone could understand what it is. It's called Himno, just translates to hymn. And it goes, "This morning, there is in the air an incredible fragrance of the roses of heaven. Adam discovers the freshness of water. A rain of gold falls from the sky. It is the love of Zeus. A fish jumps from the sea, and a man from Agrigento will remember having been that fish. In the cavern, whose name will be Altamira, a hand without a face traces the curve of a loin of a bison. The slow hand of Virgilio strokes the silk that caravans and ships brought from the reign of the Yellow Emperor. The first nightingale sings in Hungary. Jesus sees on the coin the profile of Caesar. Pythagoras reveals to the Greeks that the form of time is a circle. In an island of the ocean, the greyhounds of silver pursue the deer of gold. On an anvil, they forge the sword that will be faithful to Sigurd. Whitman sings in Manhattan. Homer is born in 7 cities. A maiden just caught the white unicorn. All the past returns as one wave, and those ancient things recur because a woman has kissed you." So I thought that was a good start out for a podcast based on masculinity and sexuality.
I've never heard it before, so I thank you for sharing it. It's definitely, without it in front of me, it sounds very much in tune with nature, with the feminine side, which I like. It sounds very poetic, which is, it's a poem, so you'd hope so.
Yeah. So this guy Borges, he has this almost magical way of just creating these storylines where he just creates these worlds, and and here he's showing the magic that is felt by this man because when he kisses this woman, this attraction, and I'd say that that's one of the things that drives sexuality is this desire for women. It's just this powerful thing that motivates people towards finding the mate in life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting. We're recording this a day before Valentine's Day, and there's lots of questions, obviously, for a lot of young men right now who are thinking of like, if they're single or together, like what does romance look like? What does sexuality, sensuality, intimacy look like? And almost every guy out there craves the kiss of a woman at some
Mm-hmm.
point, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and that's a real thing that a lot of young men have to own about themselves and take into consideration when on days like this is, it's okay to feel lonely, but what are you going to do about it? And like, how are you going to fill that gap without filling it with anger or resentment?
Yeah, exactly. So another thing I was wondering is, out of all the interviews you've done and the topics that you've covered on this topic, what's one of the main takeaways that you've had? Or there could be more than one.
Yeah. The main one is there's no one size fits all idea of masculinity, and there shouldn't be. How you as Chris think of yourself as a man, or think of what manhood is, versus me as Luke. Those two things are completely okay as long as they don't spread like hatred towards one another. Because one of the things is, and I talk about this sometimes, is there's this idea of traditional masculinity. And what does traditional masculinity look like? Well, people would say, a guy who is big and strong and lumberjack, maybe has a beard. Like, beards are considered very masculine in society, and can take care and provide for his family. And in America, especially North America too, there seems to be a like that Marlboro man, or those guys that used to be cowboys that were the epitome of masculine. Not everyone cares about those things, right? Not everyone wants to live the same life. And traditional masculinity has kind of put some of the typical characteristics in a box and said, this is the type of man that you should acclaim to be and aspire to be. I mean, under the four different archetypes, there's like the warrior, the king, the artist. Like, there's different ideas. So obviously you can't be all four in one. Typically you lean more towards the other. And I think the archetypes themselves are kind of um, pseudoscience in a lot of ways. But one thing I would say is that there's no one size fits all. It's how, if you see manhood as providing financially for your wife or your family or your partner, and working and being as not being a stay-at-home dad, or more of a traditional family, I think that's okay, as long as you don't discriminate against those who now are like, yeah, I want to be a stay-at-home dad, I want to nurture my kids, I want my wife to make all the money. Like, both of those things are fine, and they can live in harmony with one another if you just let them, if you let people be people and let them choose according to what they actually want. That would be one of the biggest takeaways that I have. And it's too much judgment in society about one masculinity versus another, or one type of man versus another. Like, listen, I'm not a guy that wears nail polish, and I don't think I ever will be. I don't see a point in it. I don't see it other than maybe a fashion statement. But there's judgment out there from guys saying, "Oh, that's really feminine, and you're less of a man because you do it." And I'm like, listen, I could say the same thing about you, in the fact that you won't let your wife work, or don't want your wife to work, because it's intimidating to your pride. And so, yeah, that's kind of my one big takeaway, is there's no one size fits all of masculinity.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's a lot of individual variation. What works for one person doesn't necessarily fit for another, and um, it's a lot of people might be too not accepting about other people's choices with these different forms of masculinity. And I like this one idea that I got from Eric Weinstein. He was talking about, he wasn't actually talking about masculinity, but I think the idea applies. And he's talking about to be uh, uh, strict with yourself, but accepting with others. Because we're all hypocrites in the end. So the most you can do is try to minimize, or the least you can do is try to minimize the much that you are a hypocrite. You
Yeah.
know, um, allow other people to live how they want to live, um, but with yourself, do what do what you feel is the best. It
Yeah.
kind of goes back to the idea of my right to swing my fist ends where the next guy's nose begins.
Mm. Yeah. And I like that quote, actually. That That makes a lot of sense to me. And what you see is a lot of men judging other men for not doing like self work themselves. Well, like everyone's broken in some way, like air quotes, you know. I really do focus on self improvement, but I don't get mad at others too much if they're
The division of labor between the sexes was more even than in other cultures where generally it was the males that were the providers and the females were stayed and they cooked, they took care of the children. Um, but obviously there are differences and similarities between the two.
yeah. Well, with even, you know, people bring up a lot. 100% is like if you think of male sports and female sports, like or men's sports and women's sports, um, a lot of the times the cross competitive wouldn't work in the more physically dominant sports. It just wouldn't have the same capabilities. At the same time, there's tons of difference between men and other men. Like yourself and myself are probably different heights, different body structures. You know, there's short guys out there who I'm sure could not match the physical capability of taller guys. And
If you had to define masculinity just simply put, how would you say that?
I would say it's the way that comes naturally to you in your like performance of being a man.
Mm,
Um, you know, I don't care about changing tires. I would say it's not a physical thing. Most of it comes from emotional. Like, are you noble? Are you doing the right things? It's a lot more virtuous than it is your physical traits. Um, but yeah, just however you think it is or works best for you without the judgment of others to be satisfied with how you see yourself as a man is quite simply enough for me. Um, I've never had too much. I used to judge a lot of other um, men for it, but now I've learned to just do my own thing. And by doing my own thing, I've had a lot of open conversations with other young men like my age about some of their insecurities, but just be who you are and don't judge anyone else for how they're trying to be unless it's actively hurting other people.
those are good words right there. So you're from Canada. How, how would you how would you say that the differences are in masculinity from there to the United States, or do you see any at all?
I would say the biggest thing is nationalism and patriotism. That seems to be the biggest difference here. Is a lot of American masculinity is tied to the political beliefs that they have. I would say that's much separate up in Canada. Now there are some, with Alberta being probably like the more conservative province, oil, laborious, blue collar jobs, where it does come to a lot of different. They're a little bit more nationalistic and uh, patriotic over there, I guess. And with America, you know, I think that is the biggest difference is that they really buy into that America is number one. America is founded on Christian institutions and Christian beliefs, foundational belief systems. And because of that spawns out the idea of, well, in order to be a good man, you have to be a biblical man. Now, I don't know what type of religious Bible they're reading sometimes in terms of how they interpret a biblical man. But I mean, my dad is a theologian. He went to Bible school, and what I see in him is completely different than the idealistic American man. So I think that's where it really ties in is that difference between how much patriotism and nationalism in America takes a role. And I don't see that almost in any other culture from from who I've spoken to and what I've talked about. It's a definitely unique part of the American journey is that American dream and that American number one mentality. And if they're not number one, it's like a shock to their pride. It's a shock to their nature as a man. It's a shock to their nation. Like you see pro-life, pro-choice come into it a lot. you see one thing I will give the people, like a lot of the traditional men in America, is the taking away of gendered terms. So like the idea of a father, I think, is an important role for a lot of people, like to have the title of father. So to take away that gendered term and make it like a parent, I think it does. I think that one is one I can get on board with, of why it's hurtful or harmful to them, because the idea of a role or the role of a father has been so important, it's prevalent in American history. So to get rid of it is something that they can't get on board with. Now, for me, I think it should be mother, father, and parent, just not just parent,
Mhm.
right? Like it's really, if you're listen back and post it, I'm like, well, that was exactly what I need to hear right now. Again, you hear when we start like big conversation, all of a sudden there's nothing to do that moment, and then it becomes a big matter. So, the one that I was sent this past week of a psychologist who offered daily life in just kind of daily life, and it's a deep dive on my own experience and theology behind it. And maybe leaning in too much in the body language is costing me further days. So that was just I don't think it's my favorite author term because for women. I like it. Absolutely fantastic book. There's a lot of here behind me. I'm trying to point. Oh, I missed it. Really, really fascinating book, but it's a very empathetic approach to men in today's society and how the systems, men aren't inherently violent, but this. I've interviewed cross-dressers, I've interviewed gentlemen in same-sex marriage, but gender roles and how gender roles play into a same-sex marriage. So I don't really have a favorite. I like them all too, because those are typically a little bit more vulnerable. One book that I read recently is called Quiet. It's about introverts, the power of introverts in a world that can't stop talking.